The Short Rider's Guide to Motorcycling. Being short is a distinct disadvantage when wanting to ride motorbikes, especially now as the seat heights seem to be quite a lot higher than they originally were in the 1980s, for example. Ross has got quite a few 1980s bikes which I can actually reasonably sit on and reach the floor quite easily. But these days, seat heights have gone up, which isn't particularly helpful to the people who are short, like me. And it's short legs that are the issue. It's not necessarily just being a short person, because some people have long legs and a short body. But I have a long body and short legs, which is not at all helpful when you want to ride motorbikes. There are some bikes that it's not even worth me contemplating trying to ride, because we wouldn't be able to lower them enough for me to ride them. And luckily, they're the style of bikes that I don't really want to ride anyway. These sort of off-roady adventure style bikes, they're just not my bag. But I do like a lot of the touring bikes, the bigger ones, you know, the ones that have all your creature comforts. But again, it's not just being short, it's also being small that doesn't help. Some of them are a bit too heavy, in the sense that if I need to push them and move them around, it's very difficult. That said, I haven't ever let the weight of a bike really put me off, and I just deal with it by better planning. As a short rider, I tend to choose bikes that I know are going to be relatively easy to lower, and there's all sorts of ways to lower the bikes, with the rear suspension, the front suspension, the seat itself, and then also you need to consider doing the side stand, because once you've lowered the bike, the side stand is usually too long. So having a good welder who is very capable of chopping out a chunk and welding it back together with maximum strength is really important. I wouldn't recommend using the aftermarket adjustable side stands. We used one once on a bike at the training school, and it was made of really poor quality metal, and it snapped and deposited me on the floor one day. It was quite entertaining. I'll see if I can dig out the video. But it just goes to show that the quality of the metal, it's just not worth it. You can't tell what you're getting these days when you're buying these things. So personally, I'd rather keep the original side stand or buy another one. So buy a spare and chop the spare or the original, so that you've then got one that's a normal length to put back on the bike if you then want to sell it. So whenever I lower a bike, I keep all the original components, and I usually buy a spare side stand. So I've got an original length side stand and the original lowering links or dog bones or whatever you want to call them, the original suspension linkage. Different bikes have different ways of being lowered in terms of the suspension. Some of them it's just a little disc that goes into the suspension unit itself. Others it's the dog bones. Because of how short I am, I usually choose the maximum amount of lowering possible, so you usually get a choice of 20, 30 or 40 millimeters, and I always go for as much as possible. If you lower the back end, you also need the front end lowered a little bit, and of course you should have this done by a qualified mechanic, unless you are competent in doing it yourself. But you do need to be careful that if you're lowering your forks, that you do them very carefully and make sure they're even. You can also take your original seat to a professional seat upholsterer or a seat adjusting person. I don't know what to call them. But there are quite a few around who do motorcycle seats, and they're very good at taking out the foam, remodeling it, making it lower but keeping it comfortable. So it's well worth looking into your options and choosing what you think is most appropriate for you. Some manufacturers have now started making low versions of their bikes or low seat options, which is really sensible, because I think they've started to realise not everybody is 6 foot tall. The other option you have is to choose your boots wisely. Now this is easier for women because women don't mind wearing boots that have a raised heel. And it rather depends on whether you're comfortable with the idea of having raised heels or not. If you do choose boots that have raised heels, however, make sure that they have a flat sole. The boots that have a chunk missing out in the middle, like your standard sort of high-heeled boots, for fashion purposes, they're not particularly useful because the shift between foot peg and gear lever and foot peg and brake becomes very difficult if that heel gets caught behind the foot peg. So you're better off making sure that you've got a flat sole with a raised sole above that flat sole, if that makes sense. Daytona makes some really good boots like that, and I think Frank Thomas also makes some that are the cheaper end of the scale. The Daytona ones I have used for years and they really are very good, but they are very expensive. I'm not sure that I can recommend any male boots that have been raised, but you could also have extra soles added to the bottom of your boots, if that makes sense. So you could actually take them to a cobbler and get them to change the soles that are on the bottom. Aside from adjustments that you can make to the bike and to your footwear, being a shorter rider is still a challenge, and potentially being a weaker person is still a challenge. So I'm not a particularly strong individual. So if I want to move the bike whilst I'm sitting on it, for example, going backwards is a challenge because I don't have much strength to move the bike if I'm sitting on it. And if I climb off to push it, once again, I'm not especially strong, but it's more about technique. If you've got nice flat ground, you can keep the bike as upright as you can and it's easier. But if you're trying to push it backwards up a hill, that's where I start to struggle because I simply don't have the strength to do it if the bike's over about 230, 240 kilos. So for me, if I'm riding a heavy bike, which I know I don't like pushing, or I find difficult pushing it, to me it's about planning. So if I'm going to park the bike, then I'll choose to park it forwards into a parking bay, only if it's slightly uphill or totally flat. Otherwise, I choose parking bays that I can ride out of forwards, or if it is slightly downhill into the parking bay, then I'll go in backwards so I can ride out of it forwards. And this involves quite a lot of planning and assessing the camber of your parking bays when you're parking the bike. It's not as easy, it's not as carefree as people who are more suitably sized for their motorbikes, because they can just park the bike anywhere and move it very, very easily. And if you find it difficult to push bikes, practice it more. It gets easier the more you do it. The less you do it, the more frightened you'll be of doing it, the more you'll avoid it, and then you'll never get any better. And if you're not comfortable doing it because you think you're going to drop the bike or you find it too difficult, then do it with somebody else who's there to help you and assist you. It doesn't need to be somebody who knows about bikes, it just needs to be somebody who could help you if you start to lose your balance with it, and they can just help you regain your balance. I remember taking my great big TDM 900 on holiday to Northumberland where my parents were staying, and they'd chosen a lovely cottage, but it had a really thick gravel driveway. And I got the bike onto the driveway, stopped and managed to put the side stand down. I then needed to move the bike to turn it around to be able to get out of the driveway again. And I wasn't going to do that on my own. I had my stepdad helping me. And he's not a biker, but he was just there to assist. And we did it quite easily, even though it was thick gravel. And thick gravel's hard because you can't get any purchase with your feet, and the bike doesn't want to move so easily through the gravel. That it didn't stop me from doing what I wanted to do, which was go on holiday on my bike and join them. Other considerations for when you're a short rider are when you're stopping, identifying the camber and working out which leg you want to put down, or whether it's going to be both, and gently on your front brake. Sometimes the road cambers off significantly to the left, and it's better to put your right foot down, which is why it's really important that you're able to put either foot down so you're comfortable with smoothly using your front brake to put your right foot down instead, and not being grabby with the front brake because you suddenly realise you've got to use the other foot. It's all in the planning. If you can plan on the approach, that will prevent you from having problems at the last minute. It's also about assessing the surface in terms of gravelly conditions, The only times that I've really dropped bikes is when my foot slipped on gravel. And that's usually when trying to park in a parking space or turn the bike around with my feet down. I think I dropped my TDM on both sides once in a parking situation. Not at the same time, these were separate incidents, but they were both where there was gravel underfoot and I hadn't really assessed it, and I was trying to move the bike on a gravelly surface and overdid the foot movement and slipped. Now that was years ago, and since then I've become a lot better at planning, and touch wood, I haven't dropped a bike for ages. Not for years. And perhaps some of that comes with experience. The more experience you get, the easier things become. Now this is interesting. I just stopped here to try and leave the driveway clear, and my front wheel is on a hump, my rear wheel is also on a hump, and my foot is barely on the floor. And that's another one of those considerations for when you are a short rider. And I didn't notice it until I stopped, at which point I had to find the floor with my toe. So as a short rider, don't put your heel down first, put your toe down first, because your leg is extended, you've got a longer leg. If you put your heel down first, you're more likely to overbalance, because you'll have to overstretch your leg to actually find the floor if it is too far away. So it's just a few tips for if you're a shorter person. I hope you found it helpful. If you've got any other tips, add them in the comments. These things are just the things that I've experienced personally.